To inform the House that the question to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan on ethics, and the Honourable Member for Calgary Shepherd on immigration, refugees, and citizenship. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today and always to address the House. And I wanted to start by drilling down on the concept of common sense. Members in the House and those who follow the debates elsewhere will know that Conservatives speak a lot about the concept of common sense. We've been highlighting the importance of restoring common sense in government decision-making. I've observed that our critics across the way and some of their friends online have responded by denigrating the use of the term common sense. Our critics say that they don't really know what we mean by common sense. And Mr. Speaker, the fact that the government is claiming not to understand what is meant or implied by common sense actually, I think, demonstrates the problem in substantial measure. The concept of common sense has a history and a meaning that's worth reflecting on and that used to be well understood. But the fact that the government in particular doesn't know what common sense is shows, I think, how far we've gone. But for their benefit, I think it's worth delving a little bit into this concept and why it's important to restore common sense decision-making in this country. Okay, so let me say first at a general level that we all know that ideas have practical consequences. We can see over time whether an idea works when implemented or not. A critical test of an idea is the practical consequences that it creates in the real world. When we consider in our policy debates the validity of an idea, we need to ask whether or not that idea will work in practice, whether it produces the effects that it is intended to produce, and whether it contributes to or undermines human flourishing. Most people in their regular lives hold ideas that they also practice. As they practice the ideas that they profess, their lives demonstrate the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of the ideas that they profess and practice. I would see this happen a lot, by the way, thinking back, Mr. Speaker, with friends I had in university. They would develop some idea about human behavior, maybe through a class or a discussion or something they read. They would put that idea into practice, then they would reap the consequences, and they would thus become either an example or a cautionary tale as a result. More often than not, in my recollection, it was a cautionary tale. And these were little but profound demonstrations of John Stuart Mill's theory on the value of experiments in living, that free people engage in experiments in living, which others can then observe, and the observation of experiments in living leads to the collective formation of norms that work and lead to greater human flourishing. So the things that most people learn and practice in order to live well-ordered, healthy, and happy lives are what we have come to call common sense. There's no central repository of the information that we call common sense, but the concept still has profound meaning. It refers to the things that most normal people have come to know by experience, and perhaps by listening to elders in their lives who have shared from their experience. Experiments in living over time produce general insights that most people recognize as true, the things that most people know by experience to be right and sensible. So if a person comes up with a new novel theory, they might well posit that it is true, but they could not consider it common sense. New novel theories often challenge common sense, and they are often wrong. Not always, but conservatism that we champion on this side of the House, conservatism is the idea that we should at least be cautious and deferential when implementing changes in order to preserve the common sense wisdom of the past. A lot of harm has been done through the capricious application of someone's ideas of what would be a good and interesting experiment. So let's consider one example of this in the policy space, so-called modern monetary theory. This is the theory that government can spend as much as they want without being constrained by revenue, without being worried about consequences. That some way, somehow, modern monetary theory posits that you could just run massive deficits in perpetuity. Needless to say, proponents of this radical theory would not consider this theory to be common sense. They wouldn't even pretend that it was common sense because it is novel and radical. even proponents, I think, would acknowledge that it's both novel and radical. Now, I think we can say that to a substantial extent, modern monetary theory has been tried in Canada by this government that no longer believes that it ever needs to target the balancing of the budget, and has more than doubled our national debt in the last 9 years they've been in office. This radical novel theory has been tried, and I think we can see now, or most people can see, that it has clearly failed. But there are many other new and novel theories that this government has tried and failed as well. They tried experimenting with a carbon tax. They tried experimenting with very high levels of non-permanent immigration in the absence of a housing policy to make up for the need that was thus created. They tried experimenting with hard drug decriminalization. This just to name a few examples of radical, novel experiments that this government imposed on this great country. Now, these were experiments in policy, and all of them failed. They were ideas that 9 years ago might have sounded good to some people in theory. But we no longer need to simply debate these ideas as theory, because we can see them in practice, and we can see that they have failed in practice. There are also ideas that I think we can say violated common sense. They went against things that we know and have known to be true for a long time about the kinds of policies that work and the kinds that don't. They tried radical new ideas, and these radical new ideas did not work. And so when conservatives talk about restoring common sense, we mean precisely against pushing back against these sorts of radical experiments and restoring an application of long-standing wisdom. We will make decisions that are rooted in this common sense experience of real people. We will replace their weak, weird, woke, and wasteful policies with common sense conservatism, with ideas rooted in the conclusive experience of history and the things that normal people know from experience to be true. Mr. Speaker, I want to make one other observation about common sense, and that is that one of the biggest attacks that we see on common sense is from privileged people who promote their luxury beliefs at the expense of everyone else. Luxury beliefs are ideas promoted by privileged people, often not actually practiced by the people promoting them, but they're promoted to confer on the promoter a kind of social recognition and status. Here are a few examples. When rich and privileged people push calls to defund the police while themselves relying on private security or living in gated communities. When politicians denounce choice in education while finding workarounds for their own families. When leaders push for higher taxes on small businesses while ensuring that they will never have to pay those higher taxes themselves. These are examples of luxury beliefs where the proponents of these radical ideas protect themselves from the impacts, and they have the power and the privilege to protect themselves from the impacts of the weird experiments. They're running an experiment, but they are stepping out of the lab so they're not affected. A normal person living in the real world cannot afford to ignore common sense for long, because a lack of common sense will catch up with them. It will have consequences for their life that they and that others will notice, and will lead to a course correction. Well-functioning democracies, by protecting the voice of the common people in decision-making, maximize the chance that collective decisions will be informed by common sense. The common people are often most in touch with common sense, because the common people have to live with the consequences of collective decisions. But a small privileged elite can often continue, even for a long time, to hold, promote, and govern on the basis of a narrow set of luxury beliefs which defy common sense, while protecting themselves from the impact of those decisions. And this fundamentally defines the record and practice of the current government, making decisions based on luxury beliefs that they can insulate themselves from, and that have in reality had devastating impacts on the lives of everyday Canadians. The Prime Minister is generally insulated from the impacts of his carbon tax. He won't even share information about how much greenhouse gases his own activities produce as Prime Minister, and we've sought that information before and haven't received it. He is a taxpayer-funded home and has never struggled to afford a home because of inherited wealth. He has the privilege to protect himself from inflation, and he does not have to live in communities that have been devastated by his own dangerous drug decriminalization policies. And so he persists in his own luxury beliefs because he does not see or experience their real world consequences. But today, many Canadians actually who once voted for him, can see the failure of his luxury beliefs and see the urgency of our call in response to these radical experiments, our call for a return to common sense, to axe the tax, to build the homes, to fix the budget, to stop the crime, to reverse these radical policies with clear common sense priorities. Our priorities, notably, correspond to these specific areas of NDP Liberal failed experiments. They brought in a carbon tax, which was an experimental idea. It was the theory that if you increase the cost of everything, that this will lead to less consumption in areas that produce carbon emissions. And that this failed because I think as history actually shows us that it's technological change that leads to changes in behavior. It wasn't through taxes on horses that we saw the transition to the automobile. It was through the invention of the automobile. And I remember seeing a post online, someone showing a picture of the street before the invention of the car and after the invention of a car and saying, see how quickly things can change. Well, the point is things changed because new alternatives were available that allowed people to adapt. We wouldn't have seen that change through a tax on horses. It just would have made taking a horse and buggy more expensive, Mr. Speaker. So the carbon tax was a theory. It was tried. It hasn't worked. The government hasn't reached their targets at all, and there are other countries that have pursued other policies that I think have been more effective than the actions of this government. So our response is to restore common sense, to reject their radical experimentation, to restore common sense in this area with our proposal to axe the tax. Now, when it comes to another area of experimentation, they brought in changes around housing and immigration, experimental changes. They radically increased non-permanent immigration to this country. And they did not have any plans around home construction. In fact, fewer homes are being built today than were built in this country in the 1970s, despite the growth in population. And this experiment of not having enough homes to meet the needs of the population, it was a radical experiment. It's an experiment that individual members of the government are insulated from the impacts of, but it was an experiment that failed. And in response to that, we want to champion a return to common sense, the common sense proposal to build the homes. Axe the tax, build the homes. Okay, then as I already talked about, they experimented with modern monetary theory. They said, hey, let's try something new. Let's try dramatically increasing spending and not worrying about at any point balancing the budget. It was a radical, novel idea. And I think many people would say it would be nice if that was true. It would be nice if we could spend infinitely without needing to worry about where the money came from, but that's just not how the world works. As Disraeli famously said, the facts of life are conservative. What goes up must come down. There's a basic reality that their experimentation defied. They acted on fiscal policy and continue to act on fiscal policy in defiance of basic common sense. The wisdom that people naturally gather over time by living normal lives, realizing that you can't spend money you don't have, and if you spend money you don't have, eventually it's going to catch up to you. That's common sense. The government tried to defy common sense. It didn't work. And in response to that failure, we have a proposal to fix the budget. That is to institute a dollar for dollar rule, which restores common sense. If you're going to spend a dollar on something, that dollar has to come from somewhere. Yes. You can't spend money that you don't have, and if you have that money, it had to come from somewhere. So it's simply asking government to discipline itself to that common sense reality. So that's our plan to fix the budget. Axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and finally stop the crime. We've seen radical experiments from this government on crime. When they took office, they made substantial changes to the bail system. And you can see, if you look at the data on violent crime in this country, how violent crime was going down under Stephen Harper, and it started to go up when this prime minister took office. It's because they made specific policy changes.
Making a point of order, the Honourable Deputy House Leader.
What does this have to do with the concurrence motion, Mr. Speaker? Like if he wants to debate the budget or another piece of legislation, perhaps he should allow the government to introduce it so that we can debate that.
I know the honourable member. We've gone through concurrence motions a lot, but we weren't doing that. We're actually on privilege right now. But I will. I will remind the honourable member that maybe to come back to the privilege motions at hand. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the radical experiments of this government on crime, and that's why Conservatives are championing common sense proposals to stop the crime. We will axe the tax, build the homes, fix the budget, and stop the crime. And these common sense principles respond to the radical experimentation of this government. And I hope that is helpful for members of the government in understanding these principles of common sense. Now, the member highlighted the privilege issue. And of course, I've talked a little bit about the privilege of the government and how they're so privileged that they've insulated themselves from the impacts of their bad policies. But in particular, by privilege, we're talking about the fact that this government has refused to hand over documents ordered by the House of Commons. And what I've been building up to, Mr. Speaker, is the reality that this government's approach to scandal and to the House of Commons demonstrates a lack of regard for the basic principles of common sense. Now, we are talking in this privilege motion about the rights of the House of Commons, fundamentally, to order the production of documents. Now, we call it the House of Commons for a reason, because the House of Commons has always been the institution that represents the common people. And I've talked earlier in this speech about how the common people are necessarily in touch with common sense by the experience of their lives, whereas it is often the case that a privileged elite can become disconnected from common sense. So we're here in the House of Commons championing the common sense of the common people. And the right of that House of Commons to, on behalf of the common people, order the production of documents that are relevant for the work of the House. And we have, in the midst of their defense of power and privilege against the common people and against the House of Commons, a government that is refusing to hand over documents that have been ordered. And in the spirit of common sense, Conservatives are going to continue to demand that those documents be handed over. But what are the documents? Aside from the principle of the right of the People's House to order the production of documents, what exactly are the documents that the government is making their stand on in defense of power and privilege against the rights of the people to see these, to order these documents? Well, it's about a corrupt green slush fund where government insiders were able to, because of their privileged access, hand out money, and they did so often to companies that were owned by people on that very board. So you had a group of insiders appointed by the government that were able to hand out $400 million to various companies, and they used that insider access, that power, to give money to their own companies. Now, this is obviously a violation of the basic principles of common sense. I think any reasonable person thinking about what makes sense, thinking about what is fair, would understand that you should not have people with the power to allocate taxpayers' dollars to companies that they own. Yes. That's just common sense. But it wasn't common sense that penetrated the elite decision-making circles within this government. And this underlines both the process of this motion, the fact that the government is refusing to hand over documents, and the substance behind it, which is what happened with the Green Slush Fund, just underline the need to restore that common sense to the decision-making that takes place here in Parliament, here in Ottawa in general. Because the very fact that these government insiders thought that what they were doing was something that was okay or that they could get away with. Just illustrates how broken things have become under this government. And I could go through the litany of scandals, Mr. Speaker. Just this week at the Government Operations Committee, where we're doing ongoing work on the Liberals' Indigenous procurement scandal, how elite non-Indigenous insiders took money that was supposed to be benefiting Indigenous companies. And in fact, that the AFN says that the vast majority of those who benefited from these set-asides were actually shell companies. We had an auditor before committee who said that he, years ago, came to the government with evidence of criminal activity by people pretending to be Indigenous, saying that these allegations should be referred to the RCMP, and the government decided not to do that. Unbelievable that an auditor would say we have criminal activity here and that this government would decide not to hand over. It's time to restore the common sense of the common people, Mr. Speaker, united for our common home, and that's what we should be standing up for in this House of Commons. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Questions and comments? The Honourable Deputy House Leader.
I certainly enjoy the choice of words by Conservatives lately because they don't talk about balancing the budget. They talk about fixing the budget. And I'm wondering if the member can tell me the difference between the two, because I certainly don't think they mean balancing it, because when you look at the history of Conservatives over the last few decades, neither Stephen Harper or Brian Mulroney balanced the budget. Actually, Harper only had 2 balanced budgets. One is questionable. That was just before he left in 2015. And the other was on the heels of Paul Martin's surplus in 2006. So my question for the member is, he talks about fixing the budget. What is the difference between fixing and balancing? And please spare me the rhetoric about I will, for every dollar I spend, I have to save. Does that basically mean that they will keep the deficit exactly where it is? Because in reality, Mr. Speaker, most governments accept the fact that running deficits is okay as long as you're growing your economy at a pace that is outpacing the deficits, in which case that has been the case for this government.
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, let's all have a bit of a chuckle about what just happened. The member said, "I want an answer to this question, but spare me the answer that I expect you to give." Well, okay, then I might as well just sit down. But no, maybe I'll just give him that answer again, so that he understands. Because maybe after a few times he'll actually learn something, Mr. Speaker. Okay, fixing the budget. We will bring in a dollar for dollar rule, which means that when a dollar is spent, this is common sense. So good for the member to hear it. When a dollar is spent, that dollar needs to come from somewhere. So the government needs to identify when they're making spending decisions. If they're proposing to spend $100 million on something over here, they need to be able to say, well, where did that $100 million come from? Right? The money has to come from somewhere to go to the spending item. That is common sense. What this NDP Liberal government has pursued is a radical policy in defiance of common sense, where they have seemed to believe that you can promise new spending without ever offering an account of where that money came from. And the effect of that has been massive inflation, making life significantly less affordable for Canadians, more than doubling the national debt, a horrible record, a record worse than any previous Conservative or Liberal Prime Minister. And Canadians are going to be living with the debt caused by this NDP Liberal government for a very long time. But we are prepared to use common sense to clean up the atrocious mess that they have created and restore our common home.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire, l'honorable député.
The honourable member for Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscouata-Lébasque. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Listen, a simple question from my colleague. In the Harper era, the Conservative government had cut the GST. He'll remember we went from 7 to 5%. I would like now to ask the colleague to explain to me why his colleague wasn't in agreement with giving a tax holiday a few years later. So what's the difference between the fiscal impact under the Conservative government and the fiscal impact right now with the Liberals?
The Sherwood Park, Fort
The honourable member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very clear the difference between a across-the-board permanent tax cut and the temporary tax trick proposed by this NDP Liberal government. We permanently reduced the GST from 7 to 6 to 5%, and we did so while balancing the budget. Of course, there were timely temporary deficits during the global financial crisis, and we brought the country back to a balanced budget. It was a prudent fiscal approach, and we were able to cut taxes permanently and across the board, cutting the GST. Now, this temporary tax trick says that, okay, certain goods, we're going to change the list of goods that are tax exempt for a period of 2 months. So you have one list of tax exempt goods now, that list is going to change for 2 months, and then it's going to change back, which is just a nightmare from an administrative standpoint for small businesses that have to manage this. And it's a trick because you are not cutting people's taxes permanently. We favor permanent, across the board, effective tax cuts to make our system simpler, more effective, and to provide Canadians the tax relief they deserve.
Questions and comments, the member Windsor West.
Well, the member's actually correct, is that under that time frame, the Harper administration did bring in the largest Canadian deficit at that time of $56 billion. Prior to that, it was Brian Mulroney in the Conservative government at $40 billion. Also during that time frame, they also brought in the HST, thank you very much, with Brian Mulroney's GST before that, and borrowed up to $6 billion to pay the different provinces to bring in the HST, which we're still paying for right now. So to my colleague right now, does he regret the Stephen Harper government for actually having us pay interest on the deficit that we have today? And then on top of that, we're actually paying interest on the money that we had to borrow to bring in their HST policy.
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member from the NDP wishes to hold me accountable for decisions of the Mulroney government. I was born in 1987. I respectfully, I know he's a little bit older than me, and he has been in this place for a long time. But I don't know that I'm necessarily well positioned to defend all the decisions of the Mulroney government at that time. I will say that over the course of the country's history up until 2015, almost 150 years of this country's history, our national debt was at a certain point. Over the Harper years, that debt to GDP ratio went down overall. We went through the global financial crisis, and we balanced the budget coming out of that. We lowered the debt to GDP ratio. But comparing the entire accumulated debt of this country from Confederation to 2015, with the debt run up in 9 years under this NDP Liberal government, more debt has been run up by one prime minister in 9 years than every single prime minister before that. So we can debate the particulars of the Mulroney government's record, of the Diefenbaker government's record. We can talk about R.B. Bennett at some point as well. But the fact is that comparing all of those prime ministers of the past, this NDP Liberal prime minister has run up more debt than all of them combined.
Questions and comments, the member for Huron-Bruce.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the member can comment a little bit about the wasteful spending. I can't believe the wasteful spending over the last 9 years. And the member from Kingston and the Islands says, well, what are you going to do? Well, I think the member here from my colleague here, I think he'll outline. We're not going to have this wasteful spending. $10 million on a cricket farm about an hour from where I grew up. $400 million in this slush fund. Millions of dollars to Loblaws for coolers. I'd like him to talk about the wasteful spending. And one last point I'll say, the member from Windsor, he's a great guy. I like him. He can talk about the spending. I remember I was here, Megan, Leslie, Nathan, Colin, they said spend more. They said spend more. So that's one thing to say it, but that's what they were saying. Thank you.
Honourable member Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great question for my colleague. I don't think there's enough time and in most of our lives actually to lay out all the waste that has happened. But I have the honor of serving on the Government Operations Committee, and I'll just highlight a few things that we've been able to identify there in terms of government waste. That while the size of the public service has grown, there's also been a dramatic increase in spending on outside consultants. And you'd expect these things to go inversely. If there was a larger public service, there'd be less need to contract out, or vice versa. But actually, under this government, there's been growth in the public service, and they're contracting out more. They're contracting to people who are then subcontracting. There's this whole class of professional contractors and subcontractors who receive and then subcontract. Companies like GC Strategies. Now, we've seen horrendous abuse of the Indigenous procurement program where non-Indigenous elite insiders pretend to be Indigenous or set up shell companies or abusive joint ventures. And then they use those arrangements to take contracts that should be benefiting Indigenous communities. So we're talking about the Green Slush Fund today. There's abuses of the Indigenous procurement program. There's outrageous spending on contracting out to friends of the government like McKinsey and others. Mr. Speaker, so these are some of the kind of obvious, significant examples. And I'm very proud of the fact that as we've put forward proposals for cutting Canadians' taxes, taking the GST off new home construction, for example. We have in every case identified where the money is going to come from. That's our approach. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming